The work came to me the way all work came to me now, through silence and necessity. No agency called. No wealthy family requested my services specifically. The estate management company in Hartford simply needed someone to fill a position, and I needed the position filled. 26 years old, living in America for 7 years, and I had perfected the art of being exactly what people needed without them ever noticing I existed. A chambermaid. That's what my life had narrowed to. A woman who moved through rooms that cost more than everything my parents had owned in St. Petersburg, dusting surfaces and changing linens for people who would never remember my face. The Connecticut estate paid better than the 3 positions I'd held before it. Better than the hotel in Newark, better than the brownstone in Brooklyn where the family's teenage son had cornered me in the laundry room until I learned to time my shifts around his absences. This job came with a shared room in the servants' wing, meals twice daily, and the particular invisibility that came from working for people who had enough money that they didn't need to see the machinery that maintained their lives. I was good at being invisible. I'd learned it the way other girls learned to apply makeup or style their hair. Through necessity, through survival, through the understanding that being noticed meant being vulnerable. When you're an immigrant with a work visa that could be revoked, when you're living in a country where you still think in Russian before translating to English, when you've spent years moving between positions because cultural fit was code for, we prefer people who look like us, invisibility became a skill worth cultivating. I kept my head down, my movements efficient, my interactions minimal. The other maids, Irina and Katura, had tried to befriend me during my first month at the estate, but I'd deflected their overtures with the polite distance I'd perfected. I couldn't afford friends. Friends asked questions. Friends wanted to know about your past, your family, your dreams. I had only one thing from my past worth protecting, and it lived in my memory where no one else could access it. My grandmother had given it to me. Not an object I could lose or a document that could be stolen, but words. A prayer in Aramaic that she'd taught me when I was 12 years old, sitting in our apartment in St. Petersburg while snow fell outside and my parents argued in the kitchen about money they didn't have. Babushka Natalia had been old even then. Ancient really, with hands that shook when she guided mine into the prayer position, her voice carrying an accent that made even Russian sound like it came from somewhere older than countries. Our family has spoken these words for longer than Russia has existed, she told me, her breath smelling of the black tea she drank constantly. Promise me you'll never forget them even when you forget what they mean. Promise me, Erika. I had promised. I was 12. I didn't understand what I was promising. Only that my grandmother's intensity frightened me in a way that made me want to please her. She made me repeat the prayer every night for 2 months until I could recite it perfectly, until the Aramaic syllables moved through my mouth with the same ease as Russian. Then she stopped asking. She died 3 months later, quietly in her sleep as if the only thing keeping her alive had been the need to pass those words to me. My parents died when I was 15. The apartment fire started in the unit below ours, some electrical failure that the investigators said should have killed everyone on our floor. I woke to smoke and heat and the sound of my mother screaming. I remember stumbling through flames, my lungs burning, my skin blistering. I remember reaching the window and throwing myself into the snow 3 stories below. I remember nothing after that until I woke in the hospital with burns on my hands and feet but nowhere else. The firefighters called it impossible. The doctors called it miraculous. My mother and father had died in their bedroom, overcome by smoke before the flames reached them. But I had walked through fire to the window, and the fire had somehow left most of me untouched. I didn't connect it to the prayer then. I was 15, orphaned, alone. I spent the next 2 years in state care, moving between facilities and foster situations that never quite worked. At 17 I applied for the work visa program, desperate to leave Russia and the memories that suffocated me there. America seemed like escape, a place where I could rebuild as someone new, someone without history. But I kept the prayer. Every night, no matter where I was living or how exhausted I felt, I whispered those Aramaic words into the darkness. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't know why my grandmother had been so insistent that I memorize them. I only knew that speaking them made me feel less alone, made me feel connected to something larger than my small, careful life. The estate where I worked had a chapel. Not a modern room for meditation or reflection, but an actual chapel. Old stone that predated the main house by at least a century, tucked away in the east wing where most of the staff never ventured. I discovered it during my second week while cleaning in used rooms. The door had been unlocked, the interior dark and cold and smelling of dust and old incense. Something about the space had called to me. Maybe it was the stone which reminded me of churches in St. Petersburg. Maybe it was the silence, deeper than the silence in the rest of the estate. Maybe it was simply that I'd been looking for a place where I could be alone without the risk of someone needing me to be useful. I started going there at midnight. After my shift ended, after the estate settled into its nighttime quiet, I would slip through the hallways to the chapel. I'd kneel on the cold stone floor, my breath visible in the unheated air, and I'd speak my grandmother's prayer into the darkness. The Aramaic words echoed differently in that space, not absorbed by carpet and drywall, but amplified by stone and emptiness. It made the prayer feel more real, more powerful, as if I was speaking to something that might actually be listening. I never expected anyone to hear me. The chapel was abandoned, forgotten, a relic maintained only because removing it would be more trouble than leaving it alone. But on a Tuesday night in late October, 3 months after I'd started working at the estate, I knelt in that chapel and spoke my grandmother's prayer, and for the first time in 11 years I felt watched. Not threatened. Not unsafe. Just observed. By something ancient and patient and utterly still. I finished the prayer, my voice faltering slightly as I spoke the ancestral names at the end. Names I'd never understood, names that my grandmother had made me memorize with the same intensity as the prayer itself. Rachel and Yatir and House of Shemaiah. I spoke them into the darkness, and the darkness seemed to hold its breath. Then I rose, unsteady, and left the chapel more quickly than I'd intended. Behind me the old stone walls held whatever I'd awakened. And somewhere in the estate, the owner I'd never seen in 3 months of employment stood in shadows I couldn't perceive, listening to a prayer he hadn't heard in 3,000 years, spoken in the exact dialect of his human childhood by a woman who shouldn't exist. My shift ended at 11:45 p.m., the same time it ended every night. I moved through the final room check with the efficiency of someone who had learned that speed was a form of protection. The faster you finished, the less time anyone had to notice you were there. The guest wing on the 3rd floor was empty tonight, as it had been for the past 2 weeks. But Mrs. Chin still required every room to be inspected before midnight. I straightened a decorative pillow that didn't need straightening, confirmed the windows were locked, and made my way back through the hallway with footsteps so quiet they barely registered on the antique runner. The estate settled into its nighttime silence around me. This was the hour I'd learned to anticipate, when the building exhaled and became something other than a workplace. The enormous house with its 23 bedrooms and 8 bathrooms and rooms I still hadn't been inside after 3 months. All of it transformed into something almost peaceful once the day staff left and the family retreated to their private wing. I was supposed to retreat too, back to the servants' quarters where Irina would be asleep already and Katura would be reading on her phone with earbuds in, both of them existing in the same room without requiring anything from me beyond basic courtesy. But I didn't go to the servants' quarters. Not yet. Instead, I moved through the east wing toward the chapel, my keys silent against my hip because I'd wrapped them in fabric months ago to eliminate the sound. The hallway here was darker, the overhead lighting reduced to every 3rd fixture. No one came to this part of the estate. The rooms were closed off, furniture covered with sheets, waiting for renovations that had been discussed but never scheduled. The chapel sat at the end of the hallway, behind a door of dark wood that was always unlocked, as if even Mrs. Chin had forgotten it existed. I pushed the door open and stepped into cold that had nothing to do with New England autumn. The chapel was always cold, a bone-deep chill that came from stone walls thick enough to have survived whatever century they'd been constructed in. My breath misted in the darkness as I closed the door behind me, shutting out the estate's ambient light. Candles sat in iron holders along the walls. I'd found them my first visit, along with matches in a metal box that looked older than my grandmother. And I lit 4 of them now, watching flame catch and hold, throwing shadows across stone that had been carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The architecture was wrong for Connecticut. Wrong for America entirely. The vaulted ceiling, the narrow windows with their ancient glass, The altar at the far end with its Hebrew inscriptions worn almost smooth by time. All of it felt transported from somewhere else, some other era when people built spaces to contain something larger than themselves. I'd grown up Orthodox, at least nominally. I knew what churches were supposed to feel like. This was different. This felt older than Christianity, older than the walls that contained it. I moved to the center of the chapel and knelt on stone that was smooth from centuries of other knees, other prayers. My hands came together automatically, muscle memory from childhood overriding years of practice, distance from faith. Babushka Natalia's voice echoed in my memory, sharp with urgency. Our family has spoken these words for longer than Russia has existed. Promise me you'll never forget them, even when you forget what they mean. I'd been 12, small for my age, frightened by the intensity in my grandmother's eyes as she'd gripped my hands between hers. Outside our apartment window, St. Petersburg had been gray with November rain. Inside, my grandmother had taught me words that felt like stones in my mouth, heavy and ancient and dangerous. I began to speak them now, my voice barely above a whisper but amplified by the stone around me. Baruch Hashomer al-Bait Shemaya. The Aramaic moved through me like water following a channel worn over time, the syllables finding their rhythm without conscious effort. Asher Shomer al-Yeladai Rachel, Asher Zakar Brit Dam Vimuna. The prayer meant nothing to me. I tried to research it years ago, but Aramaic was too fragmented, too dead, and the specific dialect my grandmother had used was too obscure for online translation tools. I only knew it was a blessing of some kind, a protection, asking for something from something that my family had believed existed. Midway through the second verse, something changed. Not in the chapel, nothing moved, nothing made sound, but in me. A sensation like being observed, like standing in an empty room and suddenly knowing with absolute certainty that you weren't alone. My voice faltered, but I forced myself to continue. This had happened before, this sense of presence. I'd attributed it to my imagination, to the gothic atmosphere of the space, to my own need to feel like these words mattered to something other than empty air. But tonight the presence felt closer. More real. Ancient and patient and utterly still. I reached the final verse, the part where my grandmother's intensity had peaked, where she'd made me repeat the names until I could pronounce them with exactly the right inflection. Zakar Shem Rachel Bat Azariah, Zakar Shem Yatir Ben Azariah, Zakar Bait Shemaya Ad Olam. Remember the name Rachel, daughter of Azariah. Remember the name Yatir, son of Azariah. Remember the house of Shemaiah forever. The names hung in the cold air, and for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I heard something that wasn't quite an echo. As if the chapel itself was responding, acknowledging, remembering. I finished the prayer and remained kneeling, my heart beating faster than it should for someone who'd simply recited memorized words. The presence hadn't vanished. If anything, it felt more focused now, more aware of me specifically. I rose quickly, too quickly, my knees protesting. The candles threw my shadow huge against the wall as I moved toward the door. I didn't run. Running would mean acknowledging fear, but I didn't look back either. The hallway outside the chapel felt warm by comparison, almost welcoming. I locked the sensation of being watched into the same mental compartment where I kept all the other things I couldn't afford to examine too closely. My mother's face. My father's voice. The feeling of fire on my skin that hadn't left scars where it should have. Back in the servants' quarters, Irina was snoring softly in her bed by the window. Katura's phone screen glowed blue in the darkness, illuminating her face as she scrolled through something I couldn't see. Neither of them looked up when I entered. I was good at entering rooms without being noticed. I undressed quietly, hanging my uniform in the small closet we shared, and climbed into my narrow bed. Tomorrow I would wake at 6. I would clean the breakfast room and the library. I would move through the estate like a ghost, useful and forgettable. I would send money to my cousin Anya in Moscow. I would save what remained in the account I'd opened specifically to save for something undefined, some future that I couldn't quite picture but knew I needed to be ready for. I had survived by being forgettable. That was the truth I'd built my life around. The moment someone remembered my face was the moment I became vulnerable. The moment they could ask questions about my visa status or my family or why a 26-year-old woman with a university education was cleaning toilets in Connecticut. Invisibility was safety. Memory was danger. I closed my eyes and tried not to think about the presence I'd felt in the chapel, or the way the ancient names had sounded in that space, or the impossible sensation that something had been listening when I spoke words my grandmother had died protecting. Yatir Shemaiah arrived at the Connecticut estate at 11:38 p.m., 7 minutes before the chambermaid finished her shift. He'd been in Singapore 12 hours earlier, then London for 4 hours before that, moving between properties with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd had 3,000 years to perfect the logistics of immortality. 17 estates, 23 investment portfolios, 41 shell corporations. His existence had been reduced to property management and wealth preservation, to the endless work of maintaining resources across centuries while trying to remember why any of it mattered. The Connecticut house was one of his newer acquisitions. He'd purchased the land in 1743 and built the main structure in 1867, after accumulating enough local history to explain sudden wealth. But the chapel was older. Much older. He'd reconstructed it stone by stone from his village in ancient Israel, shipping the materials across an ocean that hadn't yet been named, rebuilding in secret over 3 years until the space was exactly as he remembered it from his mortal childhood. He entered through the east wing, bypassing the security system with codes that changed weekly but which he always knew. The house was dark except for the minimal overnight lighting. He moved through it without sound, his footsteps making no impact on floors that would have creaked under mortal weight. 3 millennia had taught him how to occupy space without disturbing it. The chapel drew him as it always did when he returned to this property. Not from religious need, he'd abandoned faith the night he'd been transformed, but from something closer to archaeology. An attempt to preserve some fragment of what he'd been before immortality had hollowed him into something that merely continued existing without remembering why. He pushed open the chapel door and stepped into cold that his vampire physiology registered but didn't feel. The space was exactly as he'd left it 3 months ago during his last visit. Empty, dark, untouched. He moved toward the altar, his hand trailing along stone that had been carved by his father's hands, that carried inscriptions in a language that had died 2,000 years before English was born. Memory surfaced without permission. His mother, young and alive, her hands guiding his into prayer position. He'd been 7 years old, small and serious and desperate to please her. She'd been teaching him the family prayer, the one that had been passed down through generations, the one that was supposed to protect them. Baruch Hashomer al-Bait Shemaiah, she'd whispered, and he'd repeated the words, stumbling over the harder syllables. Behind them, his sister Rachel had laughed, 6 years old, gap-toothed, trying to memorize the ancestral names their mother required them to know. Rachel Bat Azariah, she'd recited proudly. Yatir ben Azariah. Bait Shemaiah. The memory fractured as they all did eventually. He couldn't remember his mother's face anymore, only the sensation of her hands on his. He couldn't remember Rachel's laughter with any specificity, only that it had existed, that she had existed, that they had all been real once. Then he heard it. A voice. Female. Young. Speaking Aramaic. Not modern Aramaic with its Arabic influences and simplified grammar, but his dialect, the precise variation that had been spoken in his village 3,000 years ago, the one that had died when everyone who'd known it had died or been transformed into something that didn't need human language anymore. Baruch Hashomer al-Bait Shemaiah. Yatir went absolutely still in a way that only vampires could achieve, his body becoming nothing more than a statue that observed without breathing or heartbeat or any sign of life. The voice was coming from the center of the chapel where a figure knelt in prayer. A woman, dark-haired, wearing what looked like a servant's uniform. She had no idea he was present. Vampire abilities allowed him to occupy space without being perceived, to stand in shadows that shouldn't conceal him, to watch without being watched in return. She continued speaking his mother's prayer with perfect accuracy, every syllable exactly as it had been taught to him, every pause in exactly the right place. It was impossible. The dialect had been dead for millennia. Even if someone had somehow found written records, pronunciation would be guesswork at best. But this woman spoke as if she'd learned from someone who'd actually known the language, who'd carried it in their mouth as a living thing. Zachar Shem Rachel Bat Azariah, she said, and Yatir's entire being focused to a point of absolute attention. Zakar Shem Yatir ben Azariah, Zakar bait Shemaiah ad Olam. His sister's name. His name. His family name. Spoken in prayer as if they still mattered, as if anyone in this world remembered that they had once been human, that they had once belonged to something larger than his solitary immortality. I had not heard my sister's name spoken aloud in 28 centuries. And here was a woman, mortal, young, mundane, carrying her memory in her mouth like she had any right to it. She finished the prayer and remained kneeling, her breath visible in the cold air. Yatir watched her from the shadows, cataloging details with the precision that came from millennia of observation. Slavic features, probably Russian based on bone structure. Mid-20s. Undernourished in the way of people who sent money home rather than spending it on themselves. Careful movements, practiced invisibility in the way she held herself even in prayer. She rose and moved toward the door, and for a moment her face turned toward where he stood. She couldn't see him, he was certain of that, but something in her expression suggested she felt his presence. Fear perhaps. Or recognition of something her conscious mind couldn't name. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with barely a sound. Yatir remained in the chapel for 3 full minutes, processing what he'd just witnessed with a mind that usually moved faster than mortal perception could track. The prayer was impossible. The woman was impossible. The fact that she existed in his chapel, speaking his family's words, meant something he couldn't yet calculate. He moved after her, following at a distance that kept him beyond perception. She navigated the estate's hallways with the confidence of familiarity, clearly an employee. She entered the servants' wing and disappeared into one of the shared rooms where domestic staff were housed. Yatir stood in the hallway outside, listening to her breathing slow as she settled into sleep. She lived like I had lived before. Small. Careful. Invisible. As if existence itself was a privilege that might be revoked. He would need to know everything about her. Where she came from. How she'd learned words that shouldn't exist outside his memory. Whether she understood what she carried or if she was simply repeating sounds without comprehension. Most importantly, he needed to understand how someone in the 21st century could speak a prayer that belonged to his mortal family, in a dialect that had died 3 millennia ago, preserving his sister's name across an impossible span of time that should have erased every trace of their existence. The woman slept. Yatir watched. And between them, unspoken and unacknowledged, stretched a mystery that would reshape everything both of them understood about survival, memory, and the stubborn refusal of family to let time sever what blood had bound. Yatir made the first call at 4:47 a.m., while the chambermaid still slept 3 floors below him. Dr. Leonid Volkov answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the Moscow hour. It was past noon there, which meant Yatir had timed it correctly. Volkov was one of 17 researchers Yatir maintained across the globe, specialists in genealogy and historical documentation who asked no questions about why their employer needed information and accepted payment in cryptocurrency that left no traceable connections. "I need everything on a woman," Yatir said without preamble. Erika Andreeva, born St. Petersburg, approximately 1998. Last known residence in Russia before emigrating to United States in 2017. I want family history as deep as records allow, with particular attention to the maternal line. Volkov's keyboard was already clicking in the background. Timeline. 24 hours for preliminary. 1 week for comprehensive. Understood. The usual channels for delivery. Yes. Yatir ended the call and moved to the window of his private study, watching dawn break over the Connecticut landscape. 3,000 years had taught him that information was the only currency that never devalued. Empires rose and fell. Languages died and were replaced. Entire civilizations were reduced to archaeological fragments. But knowledge, carefully gathered, meticulously preserved, remained valuable across any span of time. He'd built his network of researchers over centuries, cultivating relationships with people who had the skills he needed and the discretion to never question why a wealthy client wanted obscure genealogical information about ordinary people. By the time the estate's day staff began arriving at 6 a.m., Yatir had made 6 additional calls to researchers in Jerusalem, Berlin, Warsaw, and New York. Each received the same instruction: trace Erika Andreeva's maternal lineage back through whatever records existed, with priority given to Jewish communities in Eastern Europe and Russia. Then he positioned himself to observe. The estate's architecture allowed for observation points that mortals never noticed. Spaces between walls, alcoves that appeared decorative but served surveillance purposes, sight lines that let him watch without being seen. He'd designed it that way when he'd renovated in 1867, understanding that controlling a space meant understanding its hidden geometries. From these positions he watched Erika Andreeva move through her morning routine with the efficiency of someone performing choreography they'd perfected through repetition. She was invisible in the way that skilled servants learned to be invisible, present without imposing presence, moving through rooms while the people occupying those rooms never quite registered that she was there. He recognized the technique because he'd employed it himself for centuries before he'd accumulated enough wealth to stop needing employment. It was survival strategy, a way of occupying space without triggering the territorial instincts that made humans uncomfortable with those they considered beneath their social station. She cleaned the breakfast room while the estate manager, Mrs. Chin, reviewed the day's schedule. She moved through the second-floor guest wing while maintenance staff repaired a window frame. She dusted the library while 2 of the property owner's corporate attorneys had a conference call about tax structures. In every interaction she was present but unremembered, noticed but immediately forgotten. Except that Yatir noticed everything. The way she favored her left hand when carrying supplies, suggesting an old injury to her right. The slight hesitation before she entered rooms, as if she was still expecting someone to tell her she didn't belong there. The careful distance she maintained from other staff members, deflecting conversation before it could become personal. She lived like I had lived before. Small, careful, invisible. As if existence itself was a privilege that might be revoked. By evening Volkov's preliminary report arrived via encrypted email. Yatir read it in his study while the chambermaid finished her shift 4 floors below. Bandevi, Erika Mikhailovna. Born St. Petersburg, April 3, 1998. Parents: Mikhail Andreyev, deceased 2009, and Svetlana Davidovna, deceased 2009. Both parents died in apartment fire, electrical failure, August 2009. Subject survived, raised by maternal grandmother Natalia Davidovna, 1932 to 2016, cancer. Emigrated to United States 2017 on J1 work visa, renewed twice. Current employment: domestic worker, Connecticut. Grandmother's maiden name: Davidovna, patronymic suggesting Jewish ancestry through name David. Yatir read the report 3 times, cataloging details. The naming convention struck him immediately. Davidovna, daughter of David, a Jewish patronymic preserved through the Soviet era when many Jewish families had hidden or abandoned religious identity to survive persecution. The grandmother had died in 2016, which meant she'd lived through Stalin's purges, through the systematic suppression of Jewish culture, through the pogroms and deportations that had killed millions. Yet somehow she'd preserved a prayer in ancient Aramaic. A prayer that belonged to Yatir's family, spoken in a dialect that had been dead for 2.5 millennia. He composed a response to Volkov, traced the maternal line back. As far as records exist, I want every generation documented with particular attention to Jewish communities in Russia and Eastern Europe. 1 week. Then he returned to observation. The disruptions began on the 3rd day after Yatir had heard her pray. Small things at first. I returned to my room after my shift to find my bed made differently than I'd left it. Hospital corners instead of the loose tuck I preferred. My toothbrush moved from the left side of the shared sink to the right. The book I'd been reading shifted from my nightstand to the small shelf above my bed. Katura and Irina both denied touching my things when I asked carefully, framing it as curiosity rather than accusation. Maybe you moved them yourself and forgot, Katura suggested, not looking up from her phone. I do that sometimes when I'm tired. But I knew I hadn't moved them. I'd survived this long by being meticulous about my environment, by noticing when things changed. Someone had been in my space. Someone was leaving traces deliberately, wanting me to notice without making it obvious enough that I could complain to Mrs. Chen. The sensation of being watched intensified. Not just in the chapel anymore but throughout the estate. In the library while I dusted shelves. In the hallways while I moved between rooms. In the servants' dining room while I ate my lunch alone, uncomfortable with the casual conversation the other staff maintained. On the 5th day I found the book. I was cleaning the estate's library, a room I'd come to appreciate for its silence and the quality of light through the tall windows, when I noticed a volume left prominently on the main desk. The library was supposed to be unused. None of the family was currently in residence, and the corporate attorneys who occasionally worked there always left their materials locked away. But this book sat open, marked with a ribbon, positioned as if someone had been reading it and stepped away moments before. The title was in Hebrew, Tefillat Kejamot Shel Eretz Yisrael, Ancient Prayers of the Land of Israel. I didn't read Hebrew fluently, but I'd learned enough in childhood to recognize religious texts. I opened to the marked page and found a section discussing protective prayers, with transliterations into Aramaic and notes in English about their historical context. One passage was highlighted. The House of Shemaiah maintained family prayers that predated formal rabbinic tradition, combining ancient protection invocations with genealogical remembrance. These prayers were passed orally through maternal lines and were believed to protect descendants across generations. My hands were shaking as I closed the book. Someone was leaving me messages. Someone in this house knew about the prayer. But who? I'd been invisible for 3 months, careful to never discuss my background or my habits. I prayed alone in the chapel at midnight when the entire estate was supposed to be asleep. Who in this house even knew I existed? That evening I broke my usual pattern and sought out Irina during her break. She was in the servants' common room, drinking tea and watching a Russian news program on her phone. When I sat beside her, she looked surprised but pleased. I rarely initiated conversation. Irina, I said carefully, keeping my voice low. Have you noticed anything strange lately? In the house. Her expression shifted from pleased to guarded. Strange how? I don't know. Just strange. Like someone's been in my room. Like I'm being watched. Irina studied me for a long moment, then glanced around to confirm we were alone. This house has always been strange, she said finally. The owner, we never see him. 20 years I work here, maybe I see him 3 times. And always he looks the same. Not 1 year older. That's not possible, I said automatically. I know what I saw, Irina said, her voice firm. Same face, same build, same way of moving. First time I saw him was 2004. I was new, scared, didn't speak English good. He spoke to me in Russian, told me I would be safe here, that this was a good place for people who needed to not be found. I thought he was maybe 40 years old then. I saw him again in 2012, exactly the same. And last year he came through for one night, and Erika, he hadn't changed at all. I felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Maybe it's his son? Family resemblance. Maybe. But Irina didn't sound convinced. Or maybe this is a house where time works differently. Where old things are preserved longer than they should be. She stood, gathering her phone and tea mug. Be careful with your questions, Erika. Some answers are more dangerous than not knowing. I filed this information away with everything else that didn't make sense. Let it settle into the compartment where I kept my grandmother's intensity and the fire that hadn't killed me and the presence I felt in the chapel. The comprehensive report arrived exactly 1 week after Yatir had heard the prayer. It came as a physical document, delivered by private courier in a sealed case that required his biometric authentication to open. Dr. Volkov's team had been thorough. The genealogical chart alone was 40 pages, single-spaced, tracing Erika Andreeva's maternal line back through 16 generations of meticulously documented ancestry. Yatir spread the documents across his study desk and read with the focus of someone whose existence depended on understanding what he was seeing. Russian Jewish communities 1850s present. The maternal line moved through St. Petersburg, Kiev, Minsk. Name changes documented. Davidovna to Davidova to various patronymics designed to obscure Jewish heritage during periods of persecution. Pogroms in 1881, 1905, 1918 to 1920. Stalin's purges. The Holocaust. Each event should have ended the line, but it survived, the women passing something down through daughters even when husbands and sons were killed. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth 1600s to 1850s. The line tracked through Jewish communities in Warsaw, Krakow, Vilnius. Records became fragmentary here, preserved in synagogue registrations and tax documents. The family name appeared variously as Davidowicz, David ben David. Always the maternal line carrying forward, always daughters bearing daughters. Medieval German Jewish communities 1100s to 1600s. Even more fragmentary, reconstructed from Memorbucher, memorial books, and responsa literature. The family appeared in Frankfurt, Mainz, Worms. Survived the Crusades, the Black Death persecutions, the expulsions. The women's names were sometimes documented, sometimes inferred from male relatives' records. Babylonian Jewish diaspora, 500 BC 1100 C. Here the documentation became more historical reconstruction than direct evidence. The family moved through Babylon, Persia, eventually back toward Jerusalem in various waves of return. The name shifted, Bar David, Bat David, Bite David. And then, at the bottom of page 40, the final connection. Ancient Israel, circa 1000 BC. The maternal line connected to a woman named Devorah Bat Rachel, daughter of Rachel Bat Azariah. And Rachel Bat Azariah belonged to the house of Shemaiah, Yatir's sister. His blood. The line he'd watched for 500 years after his transformation, following Rachel's descendants through Babylon and Persia, protecting them when he could, mourning when persecution scattered them beyond his ability to track. I had watched Rachel's children for 500 years. I had seen her line scatter through Babylon, through Persia, through Europe. In the pogroms of the 1880s, I believed the last of them had been killed in a village outside Kiev. I had mourned them as I mourned all my mortal connections. Briefly, brutally, then buried the grief beneath centuries of necessary detachment. But one branch had survived. Hidden in name changes, religious conversion when necessary, the chaos of 20th century Russia that made genealogical tracking nearly impossible. The women had carried it forward. Daughter to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, preserving something that the men of the family might have abandoned or forgotten. The prayer had survived because the women carried it. Generation after generation, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter. They preserved what I thought time had destroyed. Yatir sat in his study as dawn broke over Connecticut, holding proof that his sister's bloodline had survived 3,000 years of persecution, diaspora, and deliberate erasure. Proof that somewhere in the unbroken chain of women between Rachel Bat Azariah and Erika Andreeva, someone had understood that the prayer mattered enough to preserve it exactly, to teach it in the original dialect, to ensure that even when everything else was lost, these words would survive. His last living blood relative was 4 floors below him, sleeping in a shared room, invisible to everyone around her, carrying his family's legacy in her mouth without understanding what it meant. He would need to speak with her. Not yet, she was frightened already, aware of being watched, starting to ask questions. But soon. Once he'd determined how to approach her without triggering the survival instincts that had kept her safe this long. For now, he simply sat with the knowledge that he was no longer the last of his line, that Rachel's laughter had echoed forward across millennia through daughters and granddaughters who had refused to let it die, that family could survive even when he'd believed it extinct. The sun rose. The estate woke. And 3,000 years of solitary immortality began to fracture under the weight of a single impossible fact. His sister's descendant was alive, and she'd been praying with his mother's words in the chapel he'd built to remember them both. 2 weeks after hearing the prayer, Yatir made his decision. He would stop observing and start speaking. The chambermaid's routine had become predictable. She arrived at the chapel every night at midnight, prayed for approximately 7 minutes, then returned to the servants' quarters. Tonight he would be waiting when she arrived. He entered the chapel at 11:45 p.m. and positioned himself deliberately in the front pew, visible to anyone who entered. Not hidden in shadows or utilizing the supernatural abilities that would let him remain unperceived. He wanted to be seen. wanted her to understand from the first moment that this was an intentional encounter, not an accident or coincidence. The minutes passed slowly. Yatir had lived long enough that time usually moved differently for him, years compressing into what felt like weeks, decades into what felt like years. But tonight, waiting for her arrival, each minute stretched with the particular tension of approaching something that would irrevocably alter the landscape of his existence. At midnight exactly, the chapel door opened. She entered with her usual quiet efficiency, then froze 3 steps inside when she registered his presence. He watched her process the encounter. The initial startle, the calculation of whether to flee or stay, the war between instinct and something else playing across her face in the candlelight she'd lit on previous visits. I should have run. Every instinct I had developed through years of careful invisibility told me to leave immediately, to apologize for disturbing whoever this was, to retreat to my room and pretend I'd never been here. But something else, older, deeper than my learned caution, told me to stay. This was the presence I'd been feeling. This was what had been watching me pray. "Don't be afraid," he said, speaking Russian to put her at ease. "I've been waiting to speak with you." She remained frozen in the doorway, one hand still on the door handle, poised for flight. "I didn't know anyone used this chapel. I'm sorry for intruding. I can find somewhere else." "You're not intruding." He kept his voice gentle, conscious that any sudden movement or tone shift might send her running. "This chapel was built for prayer. You've been honoring its purpose. My name is Yatir Shemaya. I own this estate." Recognition flickered across her face. She'd heard the name before, probably from the other servants. The owner who was never present, who appeared so rarely that most of the staff had never met him. Now here he was, materializing in the place she'd thought was her private sanctuary. "I heard you praying," he continued. 2 weeks ago. You were speaking Aramaic." Her defensive walls went up immediately. He could see it in the way her shoulders straightened, her hand tightening on the door handle. "My grandmother taught me. It's just words. I don't even know what they mean." "They mean, blessed is the guardian who watches over the house of Shemaiah, who protects the children of Rachel, who remembers the covenant of blood and faith." He spoke the translation in the same gentle tone, watching comprehension dawn in her eyes. "Your grandmother taught you a prayer that's 3,000 years old. In a dialect that's been dead for 25 centuries. And you speak it perfectly." "That's impossible," she said, but her voice carried uncertainty now rather than conviction. Yatir stood slowly, making his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Walk with me. I'll show you impossible." For a moment he thought she would refuse, would choose flight over curiosity. But then she released the door handle and took one step forward, then another, moving deeper into the chapel instead of retreating. "Who are you?" she asked. "That," he said, "requires more than words to explain." He led her through corridors she'd never been permitted to enter, past rooms that were kept locked even from Mrs. Chen's authority. She followed at a careful distance, maintaining space between them, her body language broadcasting wariness despite her decision to trust him enough to follow. When they reached the door to his private study, he unlocked it with a fingerprint scanner that seemed anachronistic next to the antique architecture surrounding it. The study was exactly as she must have imagined rich people's private spaces to be, walls lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves, comfortable chairs arranged around a fireplace that radiated warmth, thick carpets that absorbed sound. But as she stepped inside and her eyes adjusted to the lighting, her perception would shift. Because these weren't just books on the shelves. These were artifacts. Ancient pottery sat in climate-controlled display cases. Scrolls and glass boxes lined one entire wall, their surfaces covered in scripts from languages that no longer existed. Coins from civilizations that had been reduced to archaeological footnotes were arranged in careful rows, their metal still gleaming despite millennia. Stone tablets carved with cuneiform, papyrus fragments sealed in preservation, jewelry that predated recorded history. He watched her process the room, saw her trying to categorize what she was seeing into frameworks that made sense. Collector. Museum quality. Wealth beyond her comprehension. He moved to one of the display cases and removed a clay tablet, handling it with reverence despite knowing he could drop it without it breaking. His vampire strength allowed for precise control that mortals couldn't achieve. "This is from my village," he said, holding it so she could see the inscriptions carved into its surface. 1000 BC. "This symbol," he pointed to a specific mark, "is my family name. Shemaiah." She leaned closer, studying the tablet. "You're a collector. You bought these." "I made these." He let the words hang between them for 3 heartbeats. "I was born 3,000 years ago. I've been what I am for most of that time." Her reaction was exactly what he'd expected. Skepticism mixed with the beginning of fear, rational mind rejecting what he'd said while some deeper instinct recognized truth. "That's not possible. People don't live 3,000 years. "People don't," he agreed. "But I'm not people. Not anymore." He demonstrated with the efficiency of someone who'd had 3 millennia to perfect control. One moment he was standing beside the display case. The next he was across the room, having moved faster than human eyes could track. Then he returned to the clay tablet, lifted a stone artifact from another case one-handed, a carved limestone block that had to weigh 300 pounds, and held it as easily as she might hold a book. Finally he let his eyes catch the light at the wrong angle, let them reflect like an animal's eyes reflected, showing her something that human eyes never did. She didn't scream. He'd been prepared for that possibility, but she didn't make a sound. Instead she went very still, the kind of stillness that prey animals achieved when they knew movement would trigger a predator's attack response. "I should be terrified," she whispered. Somehow I wasn't. Maybe because I'd spent so long being invisible that being seen, truly seen, by something ancient felt less like danger and more like recognition. Yatir set down the stone block carefully and gestured toward the chairs by the fireplace. "Sit. Please. I'm not going to hurt you. I brought you here to explain, not to threaten." She moved to the chair with the same careful deliberation she'd shown in following him, sat on its edge as if ready to flee at any moment. He took the chair opposite, maintaining distance between them. "I was born in ancient Israel," he began. "My father was a potter, my mother wove cloth. We were ordinary people in an ordinary village. I had a younger sister named Rachel. She was 6 years younger than me, bright and fierce and certain she would change the world." Memory surfaced. Rachel's face, finally clear after weeks of trying to remember it. "When I was 18, I was traveling to Jerusalem to trade pottery. I was attacked on the road by something I didn't have words for then. Something that killed me and brought me back as this." "A vampire," Erika said quietly. "You're telling me you're a vampire?" "Yes." He appreciated that she'd named it directly, that she wasn't trying to soften what he was with euphemism. "I became what attacked me. And I spent the next 500 years watching my family from a distance, protecting them when I could, witnessing Rachel's descendants spread through Babylon and Persia and eventually Europe." He stood and retrieved the genealogical report from his desk, brought it back to her. "In the 1880s, during the Russian pogroms, I believed the last of Rachel's line had been killed in a village outside Kiev. I mourned them the way I'd mourned all my mortal connections, briefly, brutally, then buried the grief beneath centuries of necessary detachment." She took the report, began reading, her expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to something approaching shock as she worked through the pages. "This is you," he said, pointing to her name at the top of the chart. "This is your grandmother. This line," he traced backward through the generations, "connects to Rachel Bat Azariah, my sister. You're not just someone who learned my family's prayer. You're my family. The last of my blood who still walks in daylight." Her hands were shaking as she held the genealogical report. "You're telling me I'm related to you? To something 3,000 years old? I'm telling you that the prayer your grandmother made you memorize was protection. Our family created it to protect our descendants. It's carried power, real power, covenant power, for 3 millennia. He leaned forward, his voice intense. "It's why you've survived when you shouldn't have. The fire that killed your parents. You were home. You should have died. But you walked out without a burn." She went very pale. "The firefighters said it was impossible. The entire apartment was ash, but my room was untouched. They said it was a miracle." Bad wiring that should have killed everyone on our floor, but somehow She stopped, looked at him with eyes that were beginning to believe. The prayer did that? The prayer protected you. The same way it protected Rachel's descendants through Babylonian conquest and Persian invasion and Roman occupation and medieval pogroms and the Holocaust and Stalin's purges. Generation after generation, the women of your family passed it down, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter. They preserved it exactly, the dialect, the pronunciation, the ancestral names, because they understood on some level that it mattered. Erika set down the genealogical report with hands that wouldn't quite steady. My grandmother made me promise. She said our family had spoken these words for longer than Russia had existed. She said I should never forget them even when I forgot what they meant. Her voice cracked slightly. She was dying. She used the last of her strength to make me repeat the prayer until I could say it perfectly. I thought she was just trying to give me something to remember her by. She was giving you your heritage, Yatir said quietly. She was ensuring that Rachel's line would survive one more generation. That the prayer would continue protecting you even after she was gone. He paused, then added with complete honesty, "You spoke my sister's name. You spoke my name. In the language of my childhood. I haven't heard that dialect in 2,500 years. And hearing it from you, hearing Rachel remembered across all that time." He had to stop, emotions surfacing that he'd thought he'd buried beneath millennia of detachment. She was crying now, silently, tears sliding down her face without any other indication of grief. My whole life I've been invisible. I've survived by being forgotten, by not mattering to anyone. And you're telling me I'm the last of a family that's 3,000 years old? That I matter because of blood that's been preserved across empires and catastrophes and time that should have erased any trace of where I came from? Yes, Yatir said simply. That's exactly what I'm telling you. You're not invisible, Erika Andreeva. You're the most visible thing in my world. The only proof that my mortal family mattered, that Rachel's life meant something beyond my memories, that 3,000 years of protection and preservation and stubborn refusal to let the line die actually worked. She sat in his study, surrounded by artifacts from civilizations that no longer existed, facing a vampire who claimed to be her ancestor, holding genealogical proof that connected her to ancient Israel. And slowly, incrementally, her worldview fractured and rebuilt itself around a truth that was impossible but somehow more real than anything else she'd ever known. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now," Yatir said, "I protect you the way I should have been able to protect Rachel. The way the prayer has been protecting you. As your family. And family is the only thing that's mattered across 3,000 years of existence." The argument happened 3 days after Yatir's revelation, when he informed me that I would be moving from the servants' quarters to the secure wing of the estate. "I can't just stop working," I said, standing in his study while he organized documents that detailed room assignments and security protocols. "People will ask questions. Mrs. Chun will want to know why I'm suddenly being relocated. The other maids will talk. I could lose my visa if—" "Let them ask," Yatir interrupted, his voice carrying the particular certainty of someone who'd spent 3,000 years making decisions that weren't open to negotiation. "You're under my protection now. That means you don't hide anymore." "You don't understand," I insisted, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "Invisibility has kept me safe. Being noticed means being vulnerable. If people start asking questions about why the owner is suddenly interested in a chambermaid, if immigration hears about unusual arrangements." He looked at me, then really looked at me, and something in his expression softened. "Erika, you've been hiding because you had no choice. But you have family now. You have resources. You have someone who will ensure that no bureaucrat or manager or anyone else can threaten your safety. The prayer protected you when you were alone. Now you have more than prayer." I wanted to argue further, but the truth was that part of me, the part that had been carrying my grandmother's words for 11 years without understanding their weight, was exhausted from hiding. "What will you tell them?" I asked finally. "That you're family," he said simply. "Which is the truth. The staff doesn't need details beyond that. Mrs. Chin reports to me, not the other way around." So I moved. Irina and Katura helped me pack my few belongings, their expressions careful and curious but not hostile. You have rich family? Irina asked as I folded my spare uniform into a small duffel bag. Something like that, I said, which was true enough. The room Yatir gave me was in the east wing, 3 doors down from his own study. It was larger than the entire shared space I'd occupied with the other maids. A bedroom with an attached bathroom, tall windows that overlooked the estate grounds, furniture that looked antique but felt solid and real rather than decorative. A wardrobe already held clothes in my size. Nothing extravagant but well made, the kind of practical pieces that suggested someone had actually thought about what I might need rather than what would look impressive. How did you know my size? I asked when Yatir showed me the room. I've been observing you for 2 weeks, he said without apology. I noticed details. It's how I've survived this long. A new routine developed over the following days, replacing the rigid schedule of my servant's life with something more fluid and strange. Evenings I spent in Yatir's study while he taught me the estate's history. Not just the building's construction, but the centuries of accumulated knowledge he'd stored here. He showed me artifacts from our family, handling them with reverence that made my chest tight. Rachel's jewelry, preserved in a climate-controlled case. A bronze ring with symbols I couldn't read. A necklace of carnelian beads that would have been valuable 3,000 years ago. She wore this on her wedding day, Yatir said, holding the necklace up to the light. She was 17. The man she married was kind. I made certain of that before I gave my blessing. She was 3 months pregnant when I left for Jerusalem. His mother's prayer shawl, the fabric somehow intact despite its impossible age, the weave so fine I could see individual threads. She made this herself, he said. She was teaching Rachel the same techniques before I was transformed. I took it from her body after she died. I couldn't save her, but I could preserve what she'd made. Each artifact carried weight that went beyond its material value. These were fragments of lives that had mattered, evidence that people who'd been dead for 3 millennia had existed, had loved, had created things meant to outlast them. Midnight prayers became shared rituals. We knelt together in the chapel, and Yatir taught me meanings I'd never known. The prayer broke into verses, each with specific purpose. Protection from enemies, preservation of bloodline, spiritual vigilance, remembrance of the covenant. This line here, he said, pointing to a transliteration he'd written out in Hebrew and Aramaic and English, is specifically asking for guardian spirits to watch over Rachel's children. Your grandmother preserved it exactly as my mother spoke it. 3,000 years and not one syllable changed. As we prayed together, Yatir began remembering details he'd thought were lost. My mother's face, he said one night, his voice distant. I couldn't remember specific features for centuries. But hearing you speak the prayer, I can see her now. The way she smiled when Rachel made her laugh. The scar on her chin from where she'd fallen as a child. What did Rachel's laugh sound like? I asked. He looked at me oddly. Like yours. I didn't realize it until just now, but the way you laugh, that surprised sound you make when something is actually funny rather than polite. Rachel laughed exactly like that. I felt something shift in my understanding of inheritance. Not just genetic features or blood type, but the sound of joy carrying across 3,000 years because women in my family had kept something essential alive. The last day I saw them, Yatir said during our 5th shared prayer, Rachel was pregnant with her first child. She was excited, terrified, planning names. I was leaving to trade pottery in Jerusalem, just a 3-day journey. I'd done it dozens of times. I promised her I'd be back before the baby came. His voice went hollow. The attack happened that first night. By the time I understood what I'd become, by the time I could control myself enough to return, 2 years had passed. Rachel thought I'd abandoned them. I could see it in her eyes when I finally came back and tried to explain. She was afraid of me. Her own brother, and she was afraid. But she forgave you, I said, remembering my grandmother's journal entry. My grandmother wrote that Rachel forgave you, that she knew you'd tried to come back. She did, Yatir said softly. Eventually. But those 2 years, I can never get them back. I missed her son's birth. Missed her fear and pain and joy. Those years are gone and no amount of time can return them. For 3,000 years, I had convinced myself that detachment was survival. That caring about mortals was weakness because they died and I continued. But Erika wasn't just any mortal. She was Rachel's blood. She was proof that my sister's life had mattered, that her descendants had survived empire after empire, persecution after persecution. The prayer had protected them. All of them. Until it brought her back to me. I understood something fundamental in those weeks of learning my heritage. I had spent my entire life trying to disappear. But Yatir saw me, not as a maid, not as a refugee, but as family. As someone who belonged to something ancient and important. For the first time since my parents died, I felt like I had a place in the world. Late November brought the first warning. I was in Yatir's study, reading through historical documents about Babylonian Jewish communities, when he suddenly went rigid. Not the normal stillness of someone concentrating, but the absolute frozen quality I'd learned meant his vampire senses had detected something wrong. "What is it?" I asked. He was already moving to his computer, pulling up what looked like security feeds from around the estate grounds. "Signatures," he said, his voice clipped. "Ancient ones. 3 distinct traces, moving in coordinated surveillance patterns." I came to stand behind him watching the screens. I couldn't see anything unusual, just the grounds at night, empty lawn and distant tree line. But Yatir was tracking something invisible to me. "The Nephilim Council," he said, the name carrying weight that made my stomach tighten. I should have known they'd sense her eventually. "Who are they?" I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Yatir pulled up files on his computer. Ancient texts, historical references, surveillance photographs that looked too old to be real. Ancient vampires who predate me by millennia. They're seeking to eliminate all traditional vampire weaknesses. For centuries they've been searching for specific bloodlines, families who carried original covenant blood. He looked at me, his expression grave. "Your blood is special, Erika. Not because of me, but because of what came before me. Our family descends from the original covenant people, the ones who made pacts with powers older than recorded history. Your blood carries genetic memory that they need for their ritual." "What ritual?" But I was afraid I already knew. "If they complete it during winter solstice, 3 weeks from now, they'll gain immunity to everything that keeps ancient vampires in check. Sunlight, blessed silver, religious artifacts, holy ground. Everything that limits our power would become meaningless." He stood, began pacing. "They won't just kill you quickly. They'll drain you slowly during the ritual. It will take hours. And they'll use the prayer, our prayer, as part of the invocation, corrupting it to break the covenant protections that have limited their kind for millennia." I sat down, my legs suddenly unsteady. "You're saying I'm bait? That just by existing I'm drawing them here?" "You're saying your family," Yatir corrected sharply. "And family is worth protecting no matter what comes." The attack came on December 1st, just after sunset. I was in my room reading the genealogical report for perhaps the 20th time, when alarms I hadn't known existed began shrieking through the estate. Yatir appeared in my doorway so fast I didn't see him move. "Inner chamber. Now." His voice carried absolute authority. "Don't open the door for anyone but me." He led me at a run through corridors I'd never seen, past rooms that looked ordinary until he opened a door that revealed something else entirely. A chamber lined with symbols I recognized from the chapel, walls that hummed with energy that made my skin prickle. "Stay here," he ordered, already turning to leave. "Yatir. They're here for you. Which means I need to ensure they don't survive long enough to take you." Then he was gone, moving with speed that left only displaced air. I'd never seen him as predator before. But watching him move toward the threat through the security monitors he'd left active in the chamber. Inhumanly fast, lethal grace, every movement precise and economical. I understood why ancient peoples created monster stories. He was beautiful and terrible. The confrontation was brief and brutal. 3 vampires breached the estate grounds, moving with their own supernatural speed. Yatir met them in the east garden, and what followed was violence so rapid I could barely track it on the monitors. Bodies moving faster than cameras could properly capture, flashes of silver that had to be weapons, impacts that I heard even through the warded walls. When it ended, 2 of the vampires were dead. The third escaped, wounded, disappearing over the estate wall. Yatir stood in the garden surrounded by ash. I learned later that dead vampires disintegrated rapidly and began walking back toward the house. He entered the warded chamber 12 minutes later. There was blood on his hands. Not his blood. And his eyes were still wrong, predatory, cold, the way an ancient thing looks at prey. The creature that had killed 2 vampires in under 3 minutes stood in the doorway, and some part of me understood that this was what he truly was. Not the careful scholar who taught me about artifacts. Not the grieving brother who remembered his sister. This was the vampire, the predator, the thing that had survived 3,000 years through violence. "Don't be afraid of me," he said, seeing my expression. But I surprised both of us by moving toward him instead of away. "I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid for you." I could see the wound now. A slash across his ribs that was healing slowly, too slowly, edges blackened as if burned. "What did they use?" "Blessed silver," he said. "It'll heal, just takes longer than normal injuries." I helped him to a chair, found clean cloths in a cabinet that apparently existed for exactly this purpose. As I cleaned the wound, washing away blood that wasn't his breathing gradually steadied. The predator quality faded from his eyes, replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. He had protected me with lethal efficiency. But he let me touch his wound, let me see him weakened. That trust meant more than all the explanations and genealogies combined. This wasn't just about blood or heritage or ancient prayers. This was about choosing to be family despite the danger, despite the impossibility, despite 3,000 years of reasons why attachment should be weakness. "They'll come back," Yatir said quietly. "And next time they'll bring more. Then we'll be ready," I said and realized I meant it. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The last descendant of Rachel Bat Azariah and her brother who'd been trying to come home for 3,000 years. December 15th arrived with 10 days remaining until winter solstice. Yatir moved through the estate with focused intensity, reactivating protections that had been dormant for decades. I watched him work, carrying artifacts from his study to specific points around the property. Stones carved with symbols that predated written language, iron talismans that hummed with energy I could feel on my skin, wards that he pressed into the foundation itself as if the building's bones could hold power. "These were built into the original structure," he explained as he positioned a carved limestone block in the chapel's foundation. "I designed this estate to be defensible against supernatural threats. But I haven't needed to activate full protections in over a century. The Nephilim are forcing my hand." I spent those days researching obsessively, reading through every document Yatir had given me about covenant bloodlines and ancient vampire hierarchies. I needed to understand what we were facing, needed to feel like I was contributing something beyond being the vulnerable mortal who required protection. On the 18th, while searching through boxes I'd stored in the estate's basement, the few belongings I'd kept from Russia, I found something I'd forgotten existed. My grandmother's journal. Not the one I'd read before, but a second volume hidden at the bottom of a box of photographs. The leather cover was worn smooth, the pages yellowed, filled with her cramped handwriting in Russian mixed with occasional Aramaic phrases. I carried it back to my room and read it through twice, my hands shaking. She'd known. My grandmother had known everything. About the bloodline, about the prayer's true significance, about what it meant to be descended from Rachel Bat Azariah. The entries spanned decades, documenting her attempts to protect the family's heritage while surviving in a country that had tried to erase Jewish identity. She'd written about teaching the prayer to my mother, who dismissed it as superstition. She'd written about teaching it to me, knowing I was the last chance for the knowledge to survive. The final entry was dated 3 days before her death. "If you're reading this, Erika, then you've found what I couldn't tell you directly. Our family carries something ancient. The prayer I taught you isn't just words, it's a covenant. Never stop speaking it. It will protect you when nothing else can. And if you meet him, the first one, the one who was supposed to die but didn't, tell him Rachel forgave him. Tell him she lived long enough to see her children grow. Tell him the prayer worked." I was crying when I brought the journal to Yatir's study. He read the passage I showed him and something in his expression fractured. 3,000 years of carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of words written by a woman he'd never met, carrying a message from a sister who'd been dead for millennia. "I left her," he said, his voice barely audible. "I left for one day and couldn't get back. For 3,000 years I believed she thought I'd abandoned them. I watched her grow old from a distance, too afraid to approach because she feared what I'd become. She died believing her brother had chosen immortality over family." "She didn't," I said, gripping his hand across the desk. "She knew you were trying to come back. He forgave you, Yatir. And she lived long enough to see her children grow. The prayer worked. Your mother's prayer protected them. Rachel's line survived because of what your family created. We prayed together that night in the chapel, both of us kneeling on stone that had witnessed 3,000 years of accumulated grief. And for the first time since his transformation, Yatir allowed himself to mourn fully, not the brief, brutal grief he'd permitted himself across centuries, but deep, wrenching sorrow that came from finally understanding that forgiveness had been possible all along. Winter solstice arrived with brutal clarity. The sun set at 4:23 p.m., and by 4:30, Yatir's security systems were screaming warnings. 12 ancient vampires breached the estate grounds in coordinated assault, moving with the precision of military operation. They'd brought their own magic, blood wards that I could see even from the warded chamber, crimson light spreading across the grounds like infection, countering Yatir's protections. I watched through monitors as Yatir met them in the East Garden. He fought with 3,000 years of accumulated skill, moving faster than cameras could track, eliminating threats with lethal efficiency. But 12 against 1, even when the one was ancient and powerful, was mathematics that couldn't be overcome through skill alone. The Nephilim wore him down systematically. One would engage while others positioned for strikes he couldn't fully defend against. Blessed silver blades opened wounds that wouldn't heal quickly. Ancient magic that predated his own transformation bound him in ways that his power couldn't break. I watched helplessly as they drove him backward step by step, until they'd maneuvered him into the chapel. The critical blow came from behind. A blessed silver spear driven through his chest with enough force to pin him to the chapel wall. Yatir's scream was something I felt in my bones, ancient and terrible and wrong. He hung there impaled, still conscious but weakening rapidly as the blessed metal burned through vampire flesh. The Nephilim magistrate stepped forward, a creature so old he barely looked human anymore. "We don't need you, Shemaiah. Just your blood. Thank you for gathering her in one convenient location." They breached the warded chamber 3 minutes later. The protections Yatir had built held longer than they should have, but 12 ancient vampires working in concert could break almost anything. They dragged me through corridors I'd learned to call home, past artifacts that represented 3,000 years of preserved history, into the chapel where Yatir hung pinned and bleeding. They positioned me at the altar, binding my hands with silver cord that burned my skin. The magistrate stood over me, holding a ceremonial blade that looked older than civilization. "Your family's prayer will be the key," he said. "Speak it as you die, child. Give us its power." "Erika, don't," Yatir gasped from where he was pinned. "Let the prayer die with you. Don't give it to them." But I remembered the journal. The hidden pages I'd found tucked at the very back, covered in Aramaic script that I'd needed Yatir to help me translate. My grandmother had written the complete prayer, verses that had been lost even to Yatir's memory, preserved through the maternal line because someone, somewhere in the 3,000-year chain, had understood that completeness mattered. The original covenant. The binding that came before the protection. "The prayer doesn't give power," I said to the magistrate, my voice steadier than I felt. "It binds those who violate the covenant." His eyes narrowed. "What?" I began speaking before he could stop me. Not the prayer they expected, but the complete invocation including the verses my grandmother had preserved. Aramaic words that predated vampire transformation flowed from my mouth. Asher Sodom al-Dam Habrit Yefet et Habrit. Asher Yaklu et Hashamar Yaklu Biaklam. Asher Yishbru et Hahavtacha Yishaver Bimashinitnu. Those who hunt the covenant blood forfeit the covenant's gift. Those who would consume the protected shall be consumed by their consumption. Those who break the ancient promise shall be broken by what they were given. They'd already cut my palm for their ritual. My blood pooled on the altar, and across the chapel floor, Yatir's blood flowed from his wound. The two mixed where they met in the center of the chapel. Ancient vampire and last mortal descendant, separated by 3 millennia but connected by blood that remembered its covenant. The binding activated. Supernatural light erupted from where our blood mingled, spreading across the floor in patterns that matched the ancient script of the prayer. The symbols carved into the chapel's stones, symbols Yatir had preserved from his village, began to glow with the same light. Power that had been dormant for 3,000 years remembered what it was meant to do. The Nephilim vampires began to scream. Not pain exactly, but something deeper. The sound of accumulated power being stripped away, of immortality being reduced to its most basic vulnerable form. I watched as creatures who'd existed for 4,000 years were reduced to the weakness of newly turned vampires, their immunity to silver vanishing, their supernatural strength draining away. "What have you done?" the magistrate gasped, falling to his knees. "What my family has done for 3,000 years, I said, still speaking the prayer, letting the binding verses flow through me. Protected the covenant. The blessed silver spear pinning Yatir lost its power in the covenant's presence. He pulled himself free, the wound already beginning to heal now that the blessed metal could no longer hold him. He moved across the chapel with restored strength, and what followed was brief and final. The Nephilim, reduced to vulnerability, couldn't defend themselves against a vampire who'd spent 3 millennia learning to survive. When it was over, the chapel was silent except for our breathing. Mine ragged, Yatir's unnecessary but automatic. Dawn broke outside the windows, light streaming through ancient glass to illuminate destruction that would take weeks to repair. My palm was healing with supernatural speed. I watched the wound close, flesh knitting together faster than should be possible, and understood that the blood mingling had done something more than activate the binding. Yatir's blood had changed me, not into what he was, but into something protected, something that carried vampire resilience without vampire transformation. "I'd forgotten," Yatir said quietly, sitting beside me on the steps before the altar. The prayer wasn't just protection for the family. It was binding for those who received the transformation. My maker, the first vampire, made a covenant with the original bloodlines. He would grant immortality, but those who took it could never harm the covenant bloodlines. The Nephilim tried to circumvent that binding, tried to take your blood to break free of the original promise. Your prayer reminded the universe of what they'd promised. Reminded all of us. 3 days later, on December 24th, we walked through the estate grounds in afternoon sun that Yatir couldn't fully enjoy but could watch me experience. The chapel was being restored, the main house returning to its careful quiet, the world settling back into patterns that looked normal from the outside. "I need to offer you something," Yatir said as we reached the garden where he'd first fought the Nephilim operatives. "Not because I want you to leave, but because you deserve the choice." He handed me documents, trust fund information, new identity papers, everything required to build a completely different life. $5 million. New identity documents if you want them. Release from any obligation to me or to this heritage. You can leave. Build whatever life you want anywhere in the world. The prayer will protect you. My blood in your veins. He gestured to where my palm had healed, will give you extended life, resistance to disease. You'll live perhaps 200 years as a mortal. That's my gift. My apology for dragging you into this. Or, I asked because I could hear there was an alternative. Or you can stay. Not as my servant, not as obligation. As family. As Rachel's descendant who brought her back to me across 3,000 years. I'll teach you everything I know. You'll be the keeper of our history. But that means living adjacent to what I am. To danger. To immortality that you'll watch but never fully share. I didn't need time to consider. I spent my entire life invisible, I said. My parents died and left me with nothing but a prayer I didn't understand. My grandmother died and left me alone in a world where I had no history, no roots, no reason to be remembered. He gave me back my name. You showed me I come from something that mattered enough to survive 3,000 years. I'm not leaving that. I'm not leaving you. Yatir's expression shifted into something I'd learned to recognize as profound relief mixed with joy he'd thought he'd lost the capacity to feel. Then we rebuild, he said. Together. And in the garden where ancient vampires had died trying to break a covenant that predated their existence. Where winter sun illuminated grounds that had witnessed 3,000 years of accumulated history, the last descendant of Rachel Bat Azariah chose visibility over invisibility, chose family over safety, chose to honor a prayer that had protected her across impossible time by becoming its keeper for whatever future remained.